When the first Soviet shells began falling on Berlin in April 1945, SS Obersturmbannführer Karl Brenner stood in his office at Prinz Albrechtstrasse headquarters, methodically feeding documents into a roaring furnace, watching the carefully maintained records of 3 years of operations in Poland dissolve into ash and ember. The acrid smoke stung his eyes, but he couldn't tell if the tears came from the fumes or from the realization that everything he'd believed in, the 1,000-year Reich, the invincibility of German arms, the sacred mission Himmler had preached to them in 1,000 speeches, had been reduced to this: a desperate race against time to erase his own existence from history. Outside, the city trembled under the bombardment, and inside, the machinery of terror that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Urals was consuming itself, eating its own records, its own identity, its own truth. Brenner had joined the SS in 1936, a young law student seduced by the black uniforms, the elite status, the promise of serving something greater than himself, and he'd risen through the ranks by being efficient, thorough, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of his cause. He'd supervised the liquidation of ghettos, signed deportation orders, watched trains depart eastward with human cargo, all while maintaining meticulous files, because the SS prided itself on bureaucratic precision. Every death documented, every confiscation recorded, every action justified in triplicate. But now those same files, those damning testimonies to efficiency, had become death warrants, and men like Brenner understood with crystalline clarity that the victors would not distinguish between the true believers and the reluctant followers, between the architects and the functionaries. The Wehrmacht might claim they were merely soldiers following orders, but the SS wore the stigma of the concentration camps, the Einsatzgruppen, the entire apparatus of racial war, and there would be no mercy for men in black uniforms. As Brenner watched another folder catch fire, this one containing photographs he'd rather not think about, he heard footsteps in the corridor, the sharp crack of boots that he recognized as belonging to his colleague, SS Sturmbannführer Otto Krebs, who burst through the door with wild eyes and a pistol in his belt that hadn't been there that morning. Krebs had changed since the encirclement began. The urbane, educated man who'd quoted Nietzsche over schnapps had been replaced by something feral and desperate. Still burning papers? Krebs laughed, a sound without humor. The Ivans will be here in 3 days, maybe 2, and you're worried about paperwork? But Brenner knew it wasn't just about the Russians, it was about afterwards, about the occupation, about the trials everyone whispered about how the Americans and British were already compiling lists of names, ranks, and assignments. What else can we do? Brenner asked, though he already knew Krebs had an answer. Men like Krebs always had answers, had always been one step ahead, always landing on their feet. Krebs pulled out a bundle of documents from inside his jacket, spread them on the desk. Identification papers, travel permits, letters of reference, all bearing different names, different ranks, different histories. Volkssturm papers, Krebs explained, referring to the last-ditch civilian militia Hitler had created. The chaos is our salvation, Karl. Thousands of men streaming in every direction. Records destroyed, communications cut. Who's going to verify anything? Tomorrow. I'm no longer SS Sturmbannführer Otto Krebs. I'm a Wehrmacht sergeant from a unit that doesn't exist anymore. Wounded at Seelow Heights, trying to get home to Bavaria. My tattoo. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal where the SS blood group marking had been. Every SS man had his blood type tattooed under his left arm, a convenience in battle that had become a damning identifier. The skin there was now an angry red, recently burned or cut, the tattoo obliterated through deliberate mutilation. Shrapnel wound, Krebs said simply. Very painful, very heroic, very convenient. Brenner felt something twist in his stomach. Not quite disgust, because he understood the logic, but a kind of existential vertigo at how quickly the supposedly unbreakable bonds of SS loyalty were dissolving. They'd sworn oaths, blood oaths, to die rather than betray the SS Brotherhood. And here was Krebs calmly planning to become someone else entirely. Himmler's orders, Brenner began, but Krebs cut him off with a bark of laughter. Himmler? The Reichsführer SS is probably already negotiating with the Swedes, trying to save his own skin. The whole leadership knows it's over. Kaltenbrunner's gathering intelligence for bargaining. Schellenberg's been making contacts with the Western Allies for months. Even the Führer knows in whatever's left of his mind in that bunker. The question isn't whether the Reich survives, it doesn't. The question is whether we do. Krebs leaned forward, and Brenner could smell the schnapps on his breath, see the manic energy in his eyes. I've got contacts in Schleswig-Holstein, people who can get us to Denmark, maybe Sweden. The British are more reasonable than the Russians, and if we can hold out until the chaos settles, disappear into the mass of refugees and POWs, maybe in a year or two with new identities we can start again. Argentina, perhaps, or Spain, Franco-sympathetic, and there are networks, people who understand that not everyone who wore this uniform was a monster. The word hung in the air between them. Monster. Was that what they were? Brenner had never thought of himself that way. He'd been doing his duty, following legal orders from constituted authority, implementing policies that had been debated and approved at the highest levels of government. If those policies had involved harsh measures, well, war was harsh, and the existential struggle between races that the Reich had prosecuted required difficult decisions. He'd never personally killed anyone, never pulled a trigger, never operated a gas chamber, never beat a prisoner. He'd only processed paperwork, signed forms, administered the bureaucratic machinery that made other things possible. Did that make him a monster or just a functionary? And did it matter when the victors came with their notions of collective guilt and organizational criminality? The sound of a distant explosion shook the building, closer than before, and both men instinctively looked toward the window, though the blackout curtains prevented them from seeing the red glow that surely marked another district in flames. Time was collapsing. The careful schedules and timetables that had governed SS life were becoming meaningless as the front lines dissolved and order gave way to chaos. I need to think, Brenner said. But Krebs was already shaking his head. There's no time for thinking, only for acting. Every hour you wait, the net draws tighter. Do you know what happened to Hank's staff in Breslau? The Russians took them, and I've heard. He paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. I've heard they were shown what we did in the East, shown the camps, the villages, the mass graves, and then they were handed over to the survivors. Not executed, not imprisoned, handed over. Do you understand what that means? Brenner understood. He'd seen reports from the East, the cold bureaucratic language that described reprisals and pacification operations and special treatment. And he'd learned not to think too carefully about what those euphemisms meant in practice. But the abstract knowledge was different from imagining himself on the receiving end of vengeance, and his mind shied away from the image even as it forced itself forward. I'll need papers, he heard himself say, as if the words came from someone else, and Krebs smiled, the expression transforming his face into something almost friendly. Already prepared, Krebs said, pulling out another folder. Wehrmacht discharge papers for Unteroffizier Karl Brenner. Different spelling, different unit, different history. You were conscripted in 1943, served in France, wounded in Normandy, spent time recovering, caught up in the retreat. Nothing special, nothing memorable, just another soldier trying to survive. He paused, then added, Of course, there's the matter of your tattoo, and we should do something about your hair. SS regulations kept us also neatly groomed, but soldiers in retreat don't visit barbers, so you'll need to look more ragged, more defeated. Over the next hours, as the city burned around them and the sound of artillery grew steadily closer, Brenner underwent a transformation that felt like death and rebirth simultaneously. The tattoo removal was agony. Krebs used a knife heated in the furnace's flames, then rubbed ash into the wound to obscure what remained. But Brenner bit down on a leather strap and endured, because the alternative was worse. His uniform, that perfect black uniform with its silver insignia and death's head devices, went into the furnace piece by piece, and he dressed instead in a mismatched Wehrmacht tunic and trousers that Krebs had somehow procured, complete with authentic dirt and wear. His boots were replaced with inferior models, his officer's pistol exchanged for a standard infantry weapon. His entire identity reconstituted from scratch. Other SS officers were doing the same throughout the dying Reich, Krebs explained. It had become an open secret in the final weeks that survival meant shedding identity, that the black uniform had transformed from a badge of elite status to a target painted on their backs. Some were more elaborate in their preparations: plastic surgery, complete identity theft from dead soldiers, elaborate cover stories supported by forged documents and coached witnesses, while others simply stripped off their uniforms and tried to blend into the refugee columns streaming westward. The SS network, that vast apparatus of communication and mutual support that had spanned the continent, was now being repurposed for survival rather than domination, as men who'd once commanded death squads and concentration camps reinvented themselves as simple soldiers, administrative clerks, or even victims of Nazi persecution. The irony wasn't lost on Brenner. The same bureaucratic efficiency that had made the SS so effective at implementing racial policy was now being deployed to erase that implementation, to create new histories and new identities with the same meticulous attention to detail. On April 28, with Soviet forces fighting street by street into the city center, Brenner and Krebs left Berlin in a military truck that Krebs had commandeered, joining a convoy of Wehrmacht vehicles heading northwest. The city they left behind was an apocalyptic landscape of rubble and flame, where the great stone monuments to Reich power were reduced to broken teeth against a smoke-darkened sky, where bodies lay unburied in the streets, and where the distant sound of Russian voices marked the final chapter of German rule. They drove through the night, navigating roads clogged with refugees, old men and women, children, the walking wounded, all fleeing the advancing Red Army with whatever possessions they could carry. The scenes were biblical in their desperation. Carts piled high with furniture and family treasures, mothers clutching infants, Hitler Youth boys still in uniform looking lost and abandoned, civilians who'd believed in victory until the very end now confronting the reality of utter defeat. At checkpoints, Feldgendarmerie and SS security units still tried to maintain order, still hanged deserters and defeatists from lampposts with cardboard signs around their necks. But these displays of authority were increasingly hollow gestures, death rattles of a collapsing system. Brenner showed his new papers at each stop, his heart hammering in his chest, certain that someone would notice the deception. But the guards were themselves part of the dissolution, more concerned with their own survival than with careful verification. "Keep moving," they'd say, waving the convoy through, and Brenner would allow himself to breathe again, though the relief was temporary because the next checkpoint was always just ahead. Krebs seemed almost to enjoy the deception, chatting easily with guards and fellow travelers, spinning a convincing story of their units fighting retreat from the Oder, embellishing it with enough accurate detail to satisfy curiosity without inviting too much scrutiny. Brenner marveled at his companion's adaptability. This was the same man who'd delivered lectures on racial purity and German destiny, who'd quoted Himmler's Posen speeches about the difficult but necessary work of eliminating inferior peoples, and now he was joking with Wehrmacht conscripts about the incompetence of high command and the superiority of American cigarettes. It was as if ideology had been merely a costume that could be shed as easily as the black uniform, revealing beneath it only the basic human instinct for self-preservation. They reached the British zone in early May, just as word came that Hitler was dead and that Admiral Dönitz had assumed authority in what remained of the Reich government, though authority over what was increasingly unclear. The surrender, when it came on May 7th, felt almost anticlimactic after the weeks of chaos and flight. Brenner and Krebs found themselves in a vast POW camp near Lübeck, one of dozens where hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were being processed by bewildered British authorities, who simply didn't have the capacity to carefully screen such numbers. The camps were studies in organized confusion, men from every branch of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine, mixed together with Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth, police battalions, and scattered members of the SS who'd successfully hidden their identity. The British conducted basic interviews, checking for wanted war criminals on their lists, mostly senior officers and well-known names, but the sheer scale of their prisoner population made thorough screening impossible. Brenner stood in processing lines, answered questions about his fictional unit and service history, submitted to medical examination that noted his wounds, the tattoo removal scar passed as war injury, and was assigned to a barracks. With 50 other men, none of whom he knew, all of whom carried their own secrets. The camp became a strange interregnum, a liminal space between war and whatever came next, where former enemies coexisted in uncomfortable proximity and where the certainties of the recent past gave way to profound uncertainty about the future. In the barracks at night, men talked in whispers, sharing rumors and information. The Americans and British were forming a list of criminal organizations, and the SS was at the top. There would be trials, big trials of the leadership, but also smaller trials throughout Germany. Anyone proved to have been in the camps or the Einsatzgruppen would hang. Regular SS who could prove they'd only fought as soldiers might be released eventually. The conversations were exercises in self-justification and moral accounting, as men who'd participated in the machinery of atrocity tried to parse their own complicity, to draw distinctions between different levels of guilt, to convince themselves and each other that they'd been pawns rather than perpetrators. Brenner listened more than he spoke, hearing in these whispered confessions the dissolution of collective identity. Where once these men had been bound by oath and ideology, by the mystique of Himmler's Black Order and the promise of historical vindication, now they were individuals clinging to individual survival, willing to betray former comrades if it meant saving themselves. The SS networks that had operated throughout the Reich were reforming in the camps, but with a different purpose now. Not ideological solidarity but practical conspiracy, as men shared information about fake identities, warned each other about British intelligence operations, identified which guards might be sympathetic or corruptible, and planned for the future. Some spoke of South America, of Catholic networks that could provide new identities and passage to Argentina or Chile, of communities in Patagonia where German was spoken and questions weren't asked. Others hoped simply to return home, to blend back into civilian life in the ruins of Germany, to become anonymous faces in the great mass of defeated, traumatized humanity that the war had created. Krebs was brilliant at this networking, moving through the camp like a spider at the center of a web, collecting information, trading favors, establishing connections that might prove useful later. He introduced Brenner to other former SS men who'd successfully shed their identity. A former Einsatzgruppen officer now claiming to be a Wehrmacht quartermaster, a concentration camp administrator who'd become a medical orderly, a security police investigator who'd transformed into a simple traffic policeman. Each had a story, each had prepared his deception carefully, and each carried the same haunted knowledge that discovery meant not just punishment but the confrontation with what they'd actually done, with the concrete reality behind the bureaucratic euphemisms they'd hidden behind for years. The British were beginning to screen more carefully, bringing in German-speaking interrogators, comparing prisoner statements against captured SS records, using survivors from the camps to identify perpetrators. Men disappeared from the barracks at night, taken for intensive interrogation, and some never returned. The net was tightening, slowly but inexorably, as the Allies began to understand the scale of what they'd uncovered. Brenner heard about the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, about the photographs and films being shown to the world, about the horror and disgust in the voices of British guards who'd seen what the SS had done. The crime was too large to ignore, too well documented to deny, and the world was demanding justice with an intensity that made the careful distinctions between types of complicity seem irrelevant. In July, Brenner's name was called for enhanced screening. He'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it as thoroughly as he could, but walking into the interrogation room, facing the British officer with his files and his interpreter and his steady, suspicious gaze, Brenner felt the full weight of his deception and wondered if he'd be able to sustain it. The questions were detailed and searching. What unit? Who was your commanding officer? What battles did you fight in? Can you name other men from your company? The fictional history Krebs had created for him was thorough, but under sustained questioning, gaps appeared, inconsistencies emerged, and the officer's expression grew increasingly skeptical. Then came the question Brenner had been dreading. Roll up your left sleeve. His heart stopped. He'd known they checked for the SS tattoo, but he'd hoped the scarring would be attributed to war wounds. He rolled up the sleeve slowly, revealing the angry red tissue where the blood group marking had been. The officer leaned forward, studying the scar, and Brenner saw recognition dawn in his eyes. That's not from shrapnel, the officer said quietly. That's a deliberate obliteration. You were SS, weren't you? The moment stretched out, and Brenner faced a choice that would determine the rest of his life. Continue the lie or confess the truth. He thought of Krebs's advice, of the dozens of former SS men in the camp who'd successfully maintained their false identities, of the possibility of release and return to normal life. But he also thought of the files he'd burned, of the documents he'd signed, of the trains he'd watched depart eastward, and he realized that the lie he'd been living wasn't just about the uniform but about who he'd been, what he'd done, what he'd chosen not to see. In that moment, exhausted and defeated, he felt something break inside, and the words came out before he could stop them. Yes, I was an administrator in occupied Poland. I never killed anyone myself, but I helped make it possible for others to kill. I processed deportations. I signed orders. I was efficient and thorough, and I told myself I was just following regulations, just doing my job. But I knew what was happening, or at least I knew enough, and I didn't stop. I didn't even try to stop. The confession poured out, not because he wanted mercy. He understood by now that there might be no mercy, but because the burden of deception had become insupportable, because the dissolution of the SS had also been a dissolution of the self, and he was trying to reconstitute some kind of authentic identity, even if that identity was damned. The officer listened without interruption, taking notes, and when Brenner finished, there was a long silence before the officer spoke. "You'll be transferred to a special detention facility for further investigation. If what you say is true, if you were administrative rather than operational, you may not hang, but you'll face trial and you'll likely spend years in prison. Others have confessed, you know. The burden of silence was too heavy. The ones who persist in their lies, who maintain the fiction that they were just ordinary soldiers, they're the ones having to live with themselves in the dark." Brenner was transferred the next day to a detention center where known or suspected SS members were held under tighter security, and it was there, in conversation with others who'd been identified or who'd confessed, that he began to understand the full scope of the SS final dissolution. The network of silence and mutual protection was breaking down not just under external pressure but under internal collapse, as men who'd sworn absolute loyalty found that loyalty meant nothing in the face of individual survival, that ideology evaporated when confronted with the prospect of the noose, that the vaunted SS Brotherhood was revealed as merely another human organization capable of betrayal and fragmentation. Some of his fellow prisoners had been captured trying to flee to South America with false papers and looted art treasures. Others had been identified by camp survivors who recognized their faces or voices despite their Wehrmacht disguises. Still others, like Brenner, had simply cracked under the psychological weight of living a lie, finding that the human need for authentic identity outweighed the instinct for self-preservation. They shared stories of the escape networks, the ODESSA organization that supposedly helped SS men flee to Argentina, the Vatican ratlines that provided false papers and passage to South America, the American intelligence services that were quietly recruiting former SS officers for their knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations. The dissolution of the SS, they realized, wasn't just a physical scattering but a transformation, as the organization's resources, skills, and personnel were repurposed by new masters for new purposes in the emerging Cold War. The trials, when they came, were public reckonings, with individual and collective guilt, attempts to establish legal accountability for crimes that seemed almost beyond the capacity of law to address. Brenner watched as senior officers were tried and hanged, men he'd once revered, whose orders he'd followed without question, reduced now to defendants in the dock, stripped of their mystique, revealed as ordinary humans who'd done extraordinary evil. His own trial was smaller, less theatrical, but no less devastating as prosecutors detailed his role in the deportation machinery, presented documents he'd signed, called witnesses who described the consequences of his administrative efficiency. He didn't deny the charges. Having broken the silence once, he found it easier to continue, to accept responsibility even as he tried to explain the mindset that had made such actions possible. The ideological indoctrination, the group pressure, the bureaucratic distance from actual killing, the propaganda that had convinced them they were engaged in a historic civilizational struggle rather than systematic murder. The judges listened, acknowledged these factors as context but not excuse, and sentenced him to 12 years imprisonment, with credit for time served. Years passed in detention, years of forced labor and re-education, years of confronting what he'd been part of through documentary films and survivor testimonies, years of watching Germany transform from Reich to ruin to something new and uncertain. Around him, the dissolution continued. Some former SS men never adjusted, clinging to Nazi ideology in prison cells, convinced that history would vindicate them. Others transformed themselves thoroughly, embraced democratic values with the fervor of converts, perhaps sincerely or perhaps as another survival strategy. Still others simply became hollow, broken men marked by what they'd done and undone by the consequences. Krebs, Brenner learned through the prison grapevine, had successfully maintained his false identity and been released in 1947, only to be identified 2 years later and arrested. He'd fled before trial, disappearing into the underground network of former SS men, and was rumored to be in South America under yet another identity, working for the Argentine government. The news didn't surprise Brenner. Krebs had always been a survivor, always adaptable, and perhaps that adaptability would let him escape justice indefinitely, though Brenner suspected that the psychological cost of perpetual disguise, of never being able to claim one's true identity, might be its own kind of prison. When Brenner was finally released in 1955, Germany had been divided and partially rebuilt, the Wirtschaftswunder transforming rubble into prosperity, and the past was being simultaneously confronted and suppressed in the complicated dance of post-war memory. He returned to a country that wanted to move forward while being constantly pulled backward, where former Nazis served in government while survivors demanded accountability, where silence and speech coexisted uneasily in the national consciousness. He took a job as a clerk. His administrative skills were still valuable, even if the organizations he now served were democratic rather than totalitarian, and lived quietly, neither hiding his past nor advertising it, trying to navigate the moral landscape of a society struggling with collective guilt. In the decades that followed, as Israel hunted down Eichmann and others, as trials continued sporadically, as historians excavated the full scope of SS crimes, Brenner watched the organization he'd once belonged to become synonymous with absolute evil, its very name a shorthand for the darkest possibilities of human nature when organized systematically and given state sanction. The black uniform he'd once worn with pride had become the costume of cinematic villains, the death's head symbol a universal marker of malevolence, the entire mythos of SS elitism revealed as a thin veneer over industrial-scale murder. The dissolution he'd witnessed in those final days had been both literal and figurative, the physical scattering of the organization's members and the moral dissolution of its ideology, as men who'd believed themselves to be a historic elite confronted their reduction to war criminals and fugitives. Yet even as the SS was condemned and its members prosecuted, Brenner understood that the deeper questions raised by its existence remained unanswered. How could ordinary men commit such extraordinary crimes? How did bureaucratic routine normalize atrocity? What were the conditions that allowed ideology to override individual conscience? These questions haunted him in his quiet civilian life, as he tried to understand his own transformation from idealistic student to administrator of deportation to convicted war criminal to ordinary German citizen. The answers, he came to believe, were less about the unique evil of Nazism or the SS specifically, and more about human vulnerability to authority, ideology, and the seductive appeal of being part of something larger than oneself, even when that something demanded the suppression of empathy and the mechanization of murder. In his final years, as the century drew to a close and the last generation with direct memory of the war began to pass, Brenner gave interviews to historians and educators, not to excuse or minimize what he'd done, but to bear witness to how it had been possible, how the machinery of the SS had functioned, how ordinary people had been transformed into perpetrators. He spoke about the dissolution he'd witnessed, about the pathetic scramble for survival as the 1,000-year Reich collapsed in 12 years, about the men who'd remade themselves with false papers and new identities, and about those who'd carried their secrets to the grave rather than confront what they'd done. The SS dissolved because it was never what we pretended it was, he told one interviewer near the end of his life. We told ourselves we were an elite bound by sacred oaths and historic mission, but when the test came, when everything collapsed, we were just men trying to save ourselves, willing to betray everything we'd claimed to believe in for the chance to survive. Maybe that's the ultimate truth about evil. It's not as grand or transcendent as its perpetrators imagine, just banal human weakness elevated to systematic operation and given a uniform to wear.